The boardroom was too quiet. I could hear the low hum of the air conditioning and the faint tapping of someone's pen at the far end of the table. My palms were steady, but inside my chest, a storm pressed against my ribs. Everyone's eyes weren't on me. They were on him. My husband. My CEO. The look on his face told me he wasn't here as my husband today. He was here as my executioner. "Melissa," he said, letting my name roll out like an inconvenience. "Let's keep this professional. You've been with Henderson Global for years. Your work is appreciated. But as of today, your position is being terminated." The words cut, but what really made the blood drain from my face was the movement to his left. She was there. Samantha, the so-called strategic consultant, with the laugh that dripped like syrup and the skirts that crept higher every quarter. She was leaning back in her chair, lips curled in a smile so smug it should have been a crime. The board shifted uncomfortably, but not one of them spoke. Not one. "You're firing me?" I said, voice calm but loud enough to pin the silence to the walls. "After everything I've built here?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Built? Melissa, you were supportive. But this company needs innovation, fresh direction. And Samantha brings that." That was the knife. He didn't just fire me. He slid the blade in deeper by naming her, his mistress, as my replacement. Samantha's laugh broke the silence like glass shattering. "Don't take it personally, Melissa. Business evolves. People evolve." My eyes locked on hers, and for a split second, I saw the triumph in her face. She thought she'd won. I didn't look away. "You're right. People evolve, some faster than others." Her smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to see it. Across the table, one of the older board members cleared his throat. "Is this entirely necessary, Richard?" His voice wavered as though he already knew the answer. My husband leaned back, arms folding with the smugness of a king convinced of his immortality. "It's necessary. Henderson Global must remain competitive. And my wife, my former wife, has always been more emotional than strategic. We can't afford that anymore." The humiliation was deliberate. He wanted me small, cornered, erased. I looked around the table at the men and women who'd eaten dinners at my home, toasted with champagne at our parties, whispered their secrets to me when their reputations hung in the balance. Not one of them met my eyes now. Cowards. I forced a breath through my nose. "So this is it. You're replacing me with your mistress and calling it a strategic move." The room cracked with tension. No one spoke, not even Samantha. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice dripping venom sweetened with fake pity. "Melissa, if you had focused more on business and less on appearances, maybe you'd still have a seat here." I smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of smile that makes predators pause. "Be careful, Samantha. Sometimes the seat you're fighting for collapses under you." Her cheeks flushed, but she covered it with another laugh, lighter this time, but forced. My husband slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. Melissa, your exit package will be generous. You'll sign the NDA, collect your settlement, and leave. This meeting is over." "Generous," I repeated, tasting the word. "You think money buys silence," he sneered. "It always has." And in that moment, as the boardroom lights glared overhead and every set of eyes avoided mine, something clicked. He thought he'd buried me. He thought I was powerless. What he didn't know, what not a single person at that table realized, was that the foundation of his empire had been written by my hand. Every contract, every bylaw, every clause, including the one he'd never noticed. I leaned forward, my voice low, cold, sharp enough to slice the tension in two. "You just handed me everything I need." He frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" I stood, smoothing the front of my blazer with deliberate calm. "It means this meeting isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning of yours, and trust me, your story doesn't end well." Samantha scoffed, trying to laugh it off, but her eyes darted to him, then back to me, Unease. Finally, the boardroom door opened behind me, and the assistant poked his head in, ready to announce the next agenda item. The meeting was done. I picked up my bag, every step steady, every movement measured. Before I walked out, I turned to the board, to the mistress, to the man who thought he could discard me. My voice was calm, almost too calm. You'll all remember this day. The day he fired me in front of you. The day you stayed silent. The day I smiled while he cut his own throat. The room went silent. No one breathed. I walked out without looking back. And as the door closed behind me, one thought pulsed louder than the blood in my veins. He doesn't even realize the weapon he just handed me. Before the boardroom humiliation, my life looked perfect from the outside. Charlotte loved to whisper about us, Richard Henderson, the self-made CEO with the empire downtown, and his poised wife, Melissa, the woman behind the scenes who seemed to have it all. We were the couple people toasted at galas, the faces that made charity spreads look like fairy tales. But fairy tales are only pretty if you ignore the blood it takes to build them. I had built a life out of routine, out of discipline. Every morning, before the city stirred, I was already awake. I liked the silence at 5 a.m., when even the skyline fell to sleep, when I could sip my coffee and plan the day without anyone watching. I'd check the markets, skim emails, and sometimes revise one of Richard's speeches before he stumbled out of bed. He never noticed the edits, but they were the difference between him sounding competent and him sounding brilliant. He'd walk into the kitchen, adjusting his cufflinks, always in a hurry, always pretending like the day would collapse if he didn't stride into the office at dawn. "Melissa, where's my blue tie?" he'd ask, without looking at me. Never thank you, never acknowledgement, just entitlement woven into every syllable. I told myself it didn't matter. I was the one who had chosen this life after all. I'd turned down a partnership offer from my old firm to stand at his side, to build something bigger together. I believed in us, back then. Believed that sacrifice was just another word for love. The staff adored me, though they'd never say it out loud. Assistants confided in me more than him. Board members' wives invited me to lunches they never bothered asking Richard about. At charity galas, I was the one smoothing over awkward handshakes, rescuing conversations from his bluntness. He was the face, but I was the glue. And for years I didn't mind. But every empire has cracks. His started showing in subtle ways. A joke that cut a little too close. A glass of whiskey too many at dinners, where his voice carried arrogance instead of charm. The first time I caught him dismissing me in front of junior staff, I brushed it off. Stress, I told myself. CEOs are allowed to snap. But a second time came, then a third. Each time, his eyes flicked to the room around us, almost savoring my silence. I should have seen it then. The night Samantha entered our lives was disguised as business. A consultant, he'd said, with glowing credentials and a portfolio that seemed suspiciously polished. She breezed into the office with red lipstick too bright for a corporate setting, and laughter that lingered in hallways long after she'd passed. Richard paraded her around like a prized racehorse, and everyone pretended not to notice how often his hand brushed her arm, how his eyes lingered too long. I noticed. Of course I did. But suspicion is not the same as proof, and I had no intention of being the paranoid wife gnawing at shadows. Instead, I poured myself deeper into my work, drafting contracts, advising on investor strategies, laying the legal bricks that kept Henderson Global's castle standing tall. That's when I slipped in the clause. Small, unnoticed, buried in legalese no one but me would ever bother to read. A safeguard, I told myself at the time. Insurance in case Richard's ego one day outgrew his reason. I never thought I'd need it. Our home was a gallery of pretense. The penthouse glass glittered with the skyline, dinners were plated like art, and laughter echoed at just the right times. Friends envied us, staff admired us, strangers studied us. I played the role flawlessly, the devoted wife with the sharp mind and softer smile. But behind the glass, there were hairline fractures, conversations that ended in silence, Nights he didn't come home, claiming late meetings, his cologne lingering faintly on his shirts when I knew he hadn't been in the office. One evening, I tried to test the waters. We were seated at our dining table, candles flickering against the glass walls. I asked, "Do you ever think about what we've sacrificed? About what I gave up for us?" He didn't look up from his phone. "You worry too much. Stop looking backward. Everything we have now is because of me. Because of him. Not us. Not me. Him." The words didn't just sting. They carved something out of me. And in the hollow space they left, something colder grew. Still, I clung to the hope that maybe I was imagining it. That maybe the unease twisting in my stomach was just paranoia. Until the red flag moment I will never forget. It was at the Henderson Global Holiday Gala, the one event of the year where appearances meant everything. Samantha was there, of course, draped in a gown that caught every camera flash, her hand resting a little too comfortably on Richard's arm as she leaned in to whisper. People watched, their eyes darting to me, waiting to see if I'd break character. I didn't. I smiled. I raised my glass. I laughed at the right jokes. But inside, my chest burned like a fuse lit too close to dynamite. Later that night, I found them in his office. The door was ajar, the sound of her laugh floating out. She was perched on his desk, his hand resting on her thigh as though it belonged there. I froze in the hallway, unseen, the world tilting beneath my feet. She saw me first. Her eyes flicked up, locked with mine. And instead of pulling away, instead of shame, she smiled. That smile was the warning, the declaration. It wasn't just an affair. It was a coup, and I understood in that moment that the end had already begun. The humiliation didn't end in that boardroom. It was only the opening act. The morning after Richard fired me, my email access was gone. Overnight, I had been erased from the system I had helped build line by line, clause by clause. Even my access card didn't open the office door anymore. A young intern I barely recognized was stationed at reception, and when I arrived to clear out my office, she smiled with the same brittle pity people reserve for funerals. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice tight. "Mr. Walker from HR will escort you." Escort. That was the word they used for thieves and disgraced employees. Mr. Walker wouldn't even meet my eyes. He hovered behind me while I gathered the photos, files, and the small details of a decade of sacrifice. The silence between us was heavy until he finally muttered, "This wasn't my call, Melissa. Orders came from the top." "The top," I repeated, my voice flat. "You mean Richard?" He hesitated. "And Samantha." That was the confirmation. She wasn't just replacing me. She was orchestrating my erasure. When I walked out carrying the last box, whispers followed me down the hall. Some pitying, some gleeful. None brave enough to speak out loud. I caught a glimpse of Samantha in the corner office. My office, already redecorating. She stood there with Richard's arm slung around her waist, her lips grazing his cheek as if to claim the territory. She saw me. She smirked. I wanted to smash the box into the glass wall just to wipe the look off her face. Instead, I walked past them without a word. But the humiliation was only beginning. Within days, the city knew. Gossip spread like wildfire. My firing wasn't positioned as strategic realignment. Richard and Samantha made sure of that. Articles surfaced in the Charlotte Observer, seeded with anonymous quotes from insiders. They painted me as unstable, emotional, incapable of handling corporate pressure. Melissa Henderson couldn't keep up. One line read, "She was a distraction. A distraction. After everything I had done, ghostwriting legal frameworks, stitching together investor deals, saving Richard from scandal after scandal, I was reduced to a distraction." At a charity event that weekend, whispers clung to me like smoke. Women I had once considered friends avoided my eyes. One leaned toward another, not quietly enough, and said, "Well, she had to have known. Men like Richard don't just change." The betrayal wasn't just his affair. It was the collusion. The staff who looked the other way, the board who sat in silence, the city that swallowed his narrative and regurgitated it as truth. And still, there was more. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Certified mail, with the firm's letterhead. A non-disclosure agreement, gagging me from speaking about Henderson Global's internal dealings, threatening legal consequences if I breathed a word. Attached was a severance offer, insultingly small compared to the fortune I had helped him build. I read it twice. My hands didn't shake, my breath didn't hitch. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. He wasn't just discarding me. He was burying me alive. That night, I confronted him. Not at the office, but at the penthouse we still technically shared. He was at the bar pouring bourbon, shirt undone, acting like nothing in the world could touch him. "An NDA, Richard?" I asked, holding up the letter. He didn't turn. He swirled the glass lazily, ice clinking against crystal. "Standard procedure. You're out. We don't need you whispering in corners, poisoning relationships I've built." "You've built?" I stepped closer, letting the word hang between us like a blade. "Everything you have exists because I built it. I drafted every deal, every clause, every safety net. You just signed your name at the bottom." Finally, he turned. His smirk was that of a man who believed in his own legend too much. "And yet, Melissa, I'm the one with the title. I'm the one they listen to. You? You're just the ex-wife now." Samantha padded into the room then, barefoot, wrapped in his robe as if to rub salt into the wound. She draped herself on the arm of his chair, lips brushing his ear. "You really should sign it, Melissa. No one wants this dragged out." Dragged out. As if I were the one causing the mess. I looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't just see the mistress. I saw the predator who thought she had replaced me. But what Samantha didn't understand was this. I hadn't been erased. I had been underestimated. I tore the NDA in half, then again, until pieces scattered like confetti across the marble floor. "You'll regret this," I said. My voice was calm, steady, cold. Richard laughed, full-throated, arrogant. "Regret? Melissa? I've never been more certain. You're finished. We've already filed the paperwork. You don't exist in this world anymore." He believed it. Every word. And that belief was his greatest weakness. The weeks that followed stripped the last illusions away. My accounts were scrutinized. Shared credit cards canceled. Rumors swirled that I had stolen from the company, that I was unstable, obsessive, unfit. Invitations dried up overnight. Friends vanished. Even family kept their distance, unwilling to be caught in the shadow of a scandal too big to touch. But in that isolation, clarity sharpened into something lethal. I replayed every moment in my head. The smirk in the boardroom, the pity in HR's eyes, Samantha's smile when she caught me watching them in his office. Each memory was fuel, feeding a fire that no humiliation could extinguish. And then one night, as I sat surrounded by shredded newspaper clippings and legal papers, it struck me, that clause, the one I had buried years ago, in language too dense for Richard's arrogant eyes to ever notice. A clause that, under the right conditions, could strip him of control, could unwind everything he thought untouchable. The thought landed like a blade being unsheathed. For the first time since the betrayal, I smiled. This wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't shock. It was war. The night the thought of the clause returned to me, I didn't sleep. I sat at the dining table in the silent penthouse, a glass of untouched wine sweating beside me, the city lights glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. My fingers traced the edges of the old legal binder I had pulled from the bottom of a storage box, the one Richard never knew I kept. Inside, page after page of contracts I had written bore his signature. He thought they were routine documents, boring paperwork, but I knew every line, every comma, and I knew exactly where the dagger was hidden. Clause 14B. It was so ordinary on the surface, a fallback stipulation tucked into the partnership charter. But the trigger was elegant. If the CEO engaged in misconduct or actions that materially damaged the company's reputation, His voting rights would be suspended pending review. And the review? Controlled by the board's independent legal counsel who owed me favors. At the time, I'd written it to protect us both. Now, I realized it was my weapon. For the first time since Richard had humiliated me in that boardroom, the fog of despair lifted. I didn't feel like the discarded wife anymore. I felt like the architect of his downfall. But knowing I had the weapon wasn't enough. I had to decide whether to use it. I poured another glass of wine, this time drinking it down. The decision wasn't as simple as revenge. It was about war. Once I pulled the trigger, there was no undoing it. Richard would fight, Samantha would smear me further, and the entire city would watch. If I lost, they'd bury me for good. But if I won, he'd lose everything. I stared at the skyline until dawn broke, golden light spilling across glass towers. My reflection stared back at me from the window. Tired, furious, but sharper than ever. By the time the city woke up, my decision was made. The first move was quiet. I called Henry Lawson, the firm's outside counsel, a man whose career I had once saved after a scandal nearly cost him his license. He owed me, and I didn't intend to let him forget it. Melissa? His voice cracked with surprise when he picked up. It's been a while. Not long enough for you to forget what I did for you, I said evenly. I need a favor, Henry. One that requires absolute discretion. He hesitated. Discretion I can give. But if this is about Richard, it is, I cut in. And before you object, let me remind you, if Henderson Global collapses under his arrogance, your firm's name will be buried alongside it. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to enforce what's already written in the charter. There was silence on the line. Then a slow exhale. Clause 14B. So he remembered. Good. I'll need documentation, he said. Proof of misconduct. Something undeniable. You'll have it, I promised. That night, I felt the shift inside me solidify. I was no longer reacting. I was moving forward. Richard still underestimated me. That was his fatal flaw. He strutted through Charlotte with Samantha on his arm, parading her at luncheons, acting like my absence was an upgrade. Every move he made screamed arrogance, the kind of arrogance that always leaves footprints. One evening, I crossed paths with them at a hotel lobby, purely by chance. They were laughing, drinks in hand, and Richard looked straight through me as though I didn't exist. Samantha's smirk was sharper this time, triumphant, as though she thought my silence meant surrender. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. But inside, the decision was already carved in stone. Their laughter was proof enough. They believed they'd already won. That certainty was the crack I would drive my knife into. I returned to the penthouse that night and unlocked the safe where I kept my personal copies of everything. Board votes, investor correspondence, confidential reports. The safe was heavy, the steel cold under my fingers, but when it swung open, I felt like I was staring at an arsenal. Each document was a weapon waiting to be used. Each contract was a lever. I spent hours cataloging, cross-referencing, connecting threads. Richard's financial carelessness, his misuse of company funds for personal trips, his late-night consulting sessions billed as expenses. I knew where the bodies were buried because I had buried some of them myself, back when I thought I was protecting us. Now I was digging them back up. By the third night, I didn't feel grief anymore. I didn't feel humiliation. I felt cold, steady purpose. When Richard's lawyer called to follow up about the NDA, I answered with a calmness that startled even me. Melissa, if you just sign the paperwork, this will be easier for everyone, he said, his tone rehearsed. Tell Richard, I replied, that the paperwork he should be worried about isn't in your hands. It's in mine. And when I'm finished, there won't be a company left for him to gloat over. The lawyer stammered, tried to recover, but I hung up before he could. The decision wasn't just about revenge. It was about power. About reclaiming what was mine, what had been stolen with arrogance and betrayal. From that moment forward, every step I took, every word I spoke, every ally I reached out to was calculated. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Richard thought he had buried me. He had no idea that I had already begun building his coffin. And the nails were already in my hands. The decision had been made. Now came the execution of preparation, the slow, careful construction of Richard's ruin. I began with silence. Silence was power. While Richard strutted around Charlotte with Samantha on his arm, basking in headlines about Henderson Global's innovative new leadership, I disappeared from the social circuit. People assumed humiliation had sent me into hiding. They whispered that Melissa Henderson had been broken. That narrative suited me perfectly, because no one hunts for the woman they believe has already vanished. My first step was information. I spent days combing through the safe in my penthouse, pulling contracts, financial statements, old audit reports. Each document told a story, and when I laid them out on the floor like puzzle pieces, the shape of his empire emerged. And with it, the weaknesses. Richard had been sloppy. He billed personal expenses to the company without subtlety, private jet trips that aligned with investor meetings, five-star resorts categorized as strategy retreats. I had the receipts, literally. But it wasn't just financial misconduct. Samantha's fingerprints were already showing. She had pushed through vendor contracts that redirected funds to shell companies I recognized as hastily built fronts. Her ambition was as reckless as it was obvious. I cataloged everything, every transfer, every misstep, every indulgence that could be recast as fraud. The second step was allies. I began with the people Richard ignored. He had a habit of underestimating those he considered beneath him. Middle-tier executives, assistants, accountants, people who kept the machine running but never received credit. People who remembered kindness. I met one of them, Clara from accounting, at a small cafe on the edge of town. She looked nervous sliding into the booth, her eyes darting around. "Melissa, I can't be seen with you," she whispered. "You already are," I said calmly. "And you're safe. I'm not here to ask you to betray anyone. I just need confirmation of what I already know." She swallowed, then leaned closer. "Richard's been moving money. Samantha pushed him into it. Everyone knows, but no one says anything. They're scared. Scared of losing their jobs. Scared of him destroying them," she admitted. "But if you had proof—" "I do," I cut in. "And soon, so will the board." Her shoulders loosened just slightly. She wanted him gone. They all did. By the end of that week, I had quiet allies feeding me information, whispering about late-night expenses, unrecorded withdrawals, irregular contracts. Each detail was another nail for Richard's coffin. The third step was positioning. I needed to prepare the stage. The annual shareholder meeting was less than 2 months away, the perfect arena for a public execution. Richard would be at his most arrogant, parading his mistress, flaunting growth numbers built on lies. And in that room, in front of investors and press, I would drop the blade. But I had to get closer first. Too close. One night, I entered the office building after hours using an old access code I knew security hadn't yet deactivated. The guard recognized me, smiled sympathetically, and waved me through. Another small advantage Richard never considered. Inside, the corridor smelled of polished wood and cold air. My heels echoed as I made my way to the executive floor. The sight of my old office stopped me cold. My nameplate was gone. The glass walls were draped in Samantha's taste. Gaudy art, flowers too bright. She had remade it as her throne. I forced myself past it and slipped into Richard's office instead. The drawers weren't locked. He never thought he needed to hide anything from me. Bank statements, travel itineraries, even emails printed out by his assistant were stacked in careless piles. He had always relied on me to clean his messes. Without me, he didn't even realize how sloppy he'd become. I copied everything, phone buzzing low with the silent capture of document after document. My pulse hammered, every sound amplified. The hum of the vent, the crackle of the exit sign. then footsteps. I froze, slipping into the shadow behind the desk as the door opened. Samantha's voice floated in, sharp with irritation. "Richard, you left the light." She stopped. The office was empty. My chest pressed tight against my ribs, but I didn't move. She lingered, heels clicking across the floor, fingers brushing papers. If she opened the desk drawer, I'd be caught. But arrogance saved me again. She picked up a pen, scribbled a note on a pad, and left, slamming the door. I exhaled silently, gathered the last files, and slipped out the back stairwell. I had what I needed. The fourth step was building the story. I wasn't just going to expose Richard. I was going to make it impossible for anyone to see him as anything but guilty. Every document I copied was organized into a narrative, a timeline of greed, corruption, and arrogance. I layered in the contracts Samantha had manipulated, the expense reports Richard had falsified, the shell company's bleeding money. Henry Lawson, the outside counsel, reviewed it all. "Melissa," he said one night over the phone, voice low. "This isn't just misconduct. This is criminal." "Exactly," I replied. "You realize what you're setting in motion?" "I do," I said. "And I want every lever pulled. Clause 14B is the knife. This," I tapped the stack of evidence, "is the twist." The closer I got to the meeting, the more dangerous it became. Rumors swirled that I was causing trouble. Richard's lawyer called again, threatening litigation if I didn't stay quiet. My friends warned me to back down, to move on. But retreat wasn't an option. Not anymore. One night, I sat in the penthouse again, staring at the city lights. My reflection in the glass looked nothing like the woman who had once begged Richard for acknowledgement. I looked colder now, sharper. A woman with nothing to lose, and everything to gain. The plan was ready. And as I closed the binder one final time, a thought seared through me like fire. He believed firing me would erase me. Instead, it gave me freedom. And freedom was the sharpest weapon of all. The day of the shareholder meeting dawned like judgment. I arrived at the Charlotte Convention Center in a charcoal dress that cut like steel, hair pulled back, no jewelry except a slim watch. Every step I took through the marble lobby was deliberate, heels tapping like a countdown. People stared, whispered. Melissa Henderson, the discarded wife, daring to show her face. Let them whisper. Soon, they'd choke on it. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Hundreds of investors, journalists, executives, the full machine Richard had built humming with expectation. On the stage, the Henderson Global logo glowed against a massive screen. At the podium, Richard preened, Samantha at his side, her red dress too loud, her smile too rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming with false confidence. "Welcome to a new era for Henderson Global." Applause filled the room. Cameras flashed. He was in his element, feeding on the spotlight. I took my seat in the second row, directly in his line of sight. For a split second, his voice faltered. His eyes locked on me. Surprise flickered, then arrogance returned. He smirked, as if my presence was nothing more than a mosquito he could swat away. "Today," he continued, "we unveil a bold strategy that ensures record-breaking growth. Thanks to our brilliant new COO, Samantha Lewis, Henderson Global is positioned to dominate the next decade." She stepped forward, basking in the glow, lips parting in a smile meant to humiliate me. That was my cue. I rose, calm, silent. A ripple spread through the audience. Heads turned, cameras swiveled. I held a slim black folder in my hands, the same folder I had prepared for weeks. "Before you finish rewriting history, Richard," I said, my voice carrying easily in the microphone's lull, "perhaps the shareholders deserve to hear the truth." The room froze. Gasps rippled. Richard's face tightened, fury flashing across his mask. "Melissa, sit down. You have no place here." But I didn't sit. I stepped into the aisle, folder in hand. "On the contrary, everything in this room exists because of me. And every one of you deserves to know how he's been spending your money. Murmurs erupted. Phones lifted, recording. The press leaned forward like wolves scenting blood. Richard slammed a hand on the podium. Security! 2 guards moved toward me, but I raised the folder high. Clause 14B, I said, voice cold as stone. Suspension of voting rights pending misconduct review. That stopped them. Everyone in the room knew the bylaws. Everyone knew what those words meant. Richard's face went pale. That clause is irrelevant. Is it? I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. Here we have Henderson Global billed for a private jet to the Maldives, categorized as a strategic investor meeting. Yet no investors were present. Only you, Richard, and your mistress. Gasps. Cameras flashed like lightning. I held up another. And here, vendor contracts funneled through shell companies, all approved by your so-called new COO. Money siphoned straight from the shareholders' pockets. Samantha's smile shattered. She stepped forward, voice shrill. That's a lie. Fabricated. I cut her off. Fabricated. Then explain the bank statements. I dropped copies onto the front table, pages scattering like snow. Signed by you. Cross-referenced with payments to an offshore account in your name. Sloppy, really. You didn't even bother hiding the trail. The board shifted uneasily. Investors muttered, angry now, faces hardening as they flipped through the evidence. Richard's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. This is slander. She's bitter, vengeful. Am I? I locked eyes with him, my voice steady. Or are you a thief who mistook arrogance for invincibility? The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Investors demanded answers. Richard gripped the podium, knuckles white. You think this will stop me? You're nothing without me, Melissa. I stepped closer, closing the distance until every camera caught the moment. Wrong. You're nothing without me. And as of this moment, your voting rights are suspended, effective immediately. The board chair, pale and sweating, stood. Given the evidence presented and the authority of Clause 14B, Richard Henderson's powers as CEO are hereby frozen pending investigation. The words detonated. The room exploded with noise, shouts, flashes, movement. Richard's face contorted, rage and disbelief twisting him into something almost unrecognizable. He lunged from the podium toward me, but the guards caught him, holding him back as he shouted obscenities, veins bulging in his neck. And in that chaos, Samantha made her final mistake. "Richard, tell them!" she cried, stepping forward. "Tell them it was my idea. You only did it because I pushed you." The room went silent. Every head turned. She froze, realizing too late she had confessed. Cameras zoomed in, microphones thrust forward. Investors shouted again, furious now. Their betrayal doubled. I tilted my head, smiling faintly. "Thank you, Samantha. That was the last piece we needed." Her face collapsed, panic replacing arrogance. Richard sagged against the guards, his empire crumbling in real time. He had thought himself untouchable. Now he was cornered, exposed, destroyed. Not in private, but in the very theater where he had once performed his greatness. I turned back to the shareholders, my voice carrying above the chaos. You entrusted him with your money, your trust, your future. He betrayed all of it. The empire he paraded was built on lies. And now you've seen the truth. The choice is yours. But make no mistake, Richard Henderson is finished. The board chair nodded, voice trembling but firm. Motion to remove Richard Henderson as CEO, effective immediately. Hands rose across the room, nearly unanimous. The gavel slammed. And just like that, the man who had tried to erase me was erased instead. Richard's shouts echoed as they dragged him from the stage. Samantha clutched her purse, trembling, mascara streaking down her face. The cameras didn't look away. They captured every second. The disgrace, the collapse, the perfect symmetry of betrayal returned. I stood at the edge of the stage, folder still in my hands, breath calm, heart steady. This wasn't healing. This wasn't closure. This was victory. And as I turned to leave, one final thought cut through the chaos, clean and sharp. He thought firing me was the end. Instead, it was the beginning of his destruction. When the gavel fell, Richard's empire crumbled in less than 60 seconds. The press devoured the story like wolves. Headlines the next morning weren't kind. CEO ousted amid fraud scandal. Henderson Mistress implicated in shell companies. From power couple to public ruin, every outlet replayed the footage on loop. Richard's face contorted in rage, Samantha's panicked confession, my steady calm as I held the folder in my hands. For days, Charlotte buzzed with schadenfreude. Investors who once feared Richard now mocked him in private. Politicians withdrew support. The charities that once begged for his name on their galas scrubbed him from invitations. He wasn't just disgraced. He was radioactive. But the headlines only told half the story. Behind the scenes, the board moved swiftly. Clause 14B had frozen Richard's voting power, but the fraud revelations ensured he could never return. Henderson Global needed a steady hand, someone who knew the company's bones, who had credibility with investors, who could walk into a room and restore order. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when my name surfaced. The woman Richard had humiliated, the wife he'd fired in public, the distraction he had discarded. Now the board called me the stabilizer, the safe choice. And when they offered me the CEO chair, I didn't hesitate. The day I walked into the office as Henderson Global's new leader, the air tasted different. The glass walls reflected not Samantha's gaudy flowers, but my minimalist calm. Sharp lines, clean desks, no excess. The staff stood a little taller. Some whispered congratulations. Others simply watched, their silence laced with relief. Richard's nameplate had been stripped from the corner office. Samantha's desk was empty, her belongings boxed and stacked like a cautionary tale. I took the chair behind the desk, the same chair Richard once believed was his throne. The leather was cool against my hands, the city skyline stretching wide behind me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about balance restored. But justice has a way of digging deeper than you expect. Richard didn't fade quietly. He tried lawsuits, claiming wrongful removal, slander, even marital sabotage. Each one collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Samantha, desperate to save herself, flipped on him in exchange for leniency. Her testimony painted him as the architect of fraud, a man who used her, manipulated her, and burned everything down with arrogance. The irony stung him hardest. The woman he destroyed me for was the one who destroyed him. Bank accounts froze, assets seized. Investigators combed through every corner of his empire, pulling apart years of indulgence disguised as business. The man who once boasted of untouchability was now a pariah, begging lawyers who refused to take his calls. One evening, weeks later, I found him. It wasn't planned. I had left the office late, stepping into the dim parking garage when I saw him leaning against a pillar. His suit was wrinkled, his tie askew. For the first time in years, he looked small. "Melissa," he said, voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I studied him. About what? About undoing this, about fixing it. You don't have to destroy me completely. I let silence stretch between us, the hum of the overhead light buzzing like judgment. Finally, I said, "You already destroyed yourself. I just made sure the world saw it." His face twisted, desperation breaking through. "You think you've won? You think they respect you? They'll turn on you too. That company will eat you alive." I stepped closer, my heels echoing against concrete. "The difference is, Richard, I built it. And unlike you, I know how to keep it." His shoulders slumped. For the first time, he had no comeback, no arrogance left to shield him. He turned and walked into the shadows, swallowed by the dark. As for Samantha, she vanished. Her testimony bought her freedom, but the city never forgave her. The glittering consultant in red became a ghost in plain sight. Last I heard, she was working under a different name, in a different state, clawing for scraps. And me? I rebuilt Henderson Global. Not as Richard had envisioned it, bloated with ego, dripping with vanity. But as it was meant to be, lean, strong, unstoppable. Investors returned, profits stabilized, and every meeting, every boardroom I walked into, carried the echo of that day when the discarded wife became the woman no one could erase. But the final twist came quietly, weeks later. Buried in the financials, I found an account Richard had tried to hide. A trust set up years ago, meant for family succession. In it was a clause even he hadn't realized, one I had slipped in when drafting the documents at the start of his empire. If Richard Henderson was ever removed for misconduct, full control of the trust transferred not to him, not to the board, but to his spouse. At the time, I'd thought of it as protection, an afterthought. Now, divorced and discarded, the wording still held. Spouse was defined as the legal partner at the time the trust was created, and at that time, I was the only one. Which meant every last cent he hadn't lost to seizure or fraud was mine. When I realized it, I laughed. Not the brittle laugh of humiliation I'd once swallowed, but a deep, clean laugh that echoed in the empty office. Richard thought he had fired me, erased me, stolen everything. Instead, I had taken it all. His fortune, his company, his legacy. And as I looked out over the city from the corner office, one truth settled like steel in my bones. He believed he'd buried me, but I wasn't the one in the grave. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.